What's up, guys? On today's episode number 396, entitled How to Master Your Life and Relationships Using Integrated Attachment Theory, I chat with Thais Gibson. Thais Gibson has a Ph.D. in over 13 certifications and modalities such as CBD, NLP, somatic experiencing, internal family systems, and shadow work. She has nearly a decade of experience running a successful private practice and engaging with over 30,000 clients through individual sessions, workshops, and educational platform. This diverse background has culminated in creating Gibson Integrated Attachment Theory, an innovative framework uniting traditional attachment theory, developmental psychology insights, and potent subconscious reprogramming techniques that are woven throughout the course material within the personal development school. Taught with her innovative coach training program, and her most recent book is entitled Learning Love. Obviously, just reading her bio there. But this was an incredible conversation, you guys. I truly had an amazing time talking to Thais and learned so much about attachment theory, about how it all works, about my own struggles with attachment theory growing up and how I got over that, and how to evolve in relationships together when somebody has a different attachment theory, when you're, in one place and they're in the other, and how to work together and come together to solve those problems. It really was an incredible conversation, guys, and I think you guys are going to absolutely love it. All right, guys, we're live. It's Justin Stenstrom from Elite Life Nutrition, and my guest today is Thais Gibson, the author of the book Learning Love and the creator of the Personal Development School. Thais, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here with you.
Yeah, me too. I'm really excited for today's episode. We were just talking for, I don't know, 45 minutes or so about all kinds of great topics. But this topic in particular for today's episode is actually another one of my favorite topics, which is attachment style and, relationships and how to navigate them when people have different attachment styles. So can you just quickly talk? I know sometimes it kind of can be a drawn out thing because there's a lot to go into your background, but just real quickly regarding attachment style and kind of like your focus and your training, how did you become an expert in this field?
So it's a very long story, but I'll
I
make it
know
very
we could probably
quick
spend
for you
45 minutes
into.
talking about because you have so many cool things. I looked into your past. It's really interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, so I got really interested. I guess first, there were sort of layers to it. The first layer was that I had parents who fought like crazy. So I had parents who went through a really long divorce. It went to like the Superior Court of Canada, like, a lot of chaos. So I grew up in a lot of chaos first. And I think as somebody who was like a very sensitive child, I was the oldest child of two. I definitely took a lot of it on and in, and I was kind of like the caretaker emotionally of my parents. Like they would have this huge argument, and everyone's in tears, and there's chaos, and then and then I go check on my mom, and then I go check on my dad. So I think from a young age, I was like really interested in people dynamics and human behavior, and like why does it have to be like this? So that was the first part, but then I definitely sponged in a lot of that. And then my sort of outlet growing up was sports. Like I played soccer. So I ended up getting a D1 soccer scholarship to the US from Canada. But in my scouting year, I had knee surgery. In the year that I had knee surgery, I was prescribed opiates. I was prescribed originally Percocet
Oh,
and
wow.
and and Vicodin. Both were in there. Anyways, so um what happened for me is that I went through this experience of being like, oh, when I take these, my life feels easier. And it was just before my 15th birthday. I didn't even really know what like addiction was. I was just prescribed different painkillers, and I was for sure pretty much immediately addicted. Like I just really attached to the whole experience. And I struggled with like a 6 year battle, 6.5 year battle after that of like almost daily opiate use, minus like certain periods of time where I couldn't get my hands on them. And I was really struggling, like really struggling. And I think at a one level, I was like, why is this happening? Like, why am I doing this? Like, why am I like seeking these things out and going so far out of my way? And like, I knew I had like a really big issue. And I would do things like journal at night, be like, okay, I'm going to avoid this person tomorrow. I'm going to do this. I'm going to, delete these numbers from my phone. And I had all these like planned strategies to get sober, to get clean, to stop using. It scared me, quite frankly. Like I was like young and I was like, what the hell is this? And and what ended up happening instead is I would just repeat the same behaviors over and over and over again. So I managed to make it to school. Um, I was like on the outside, probably looked like my life was pretty good, got a D1 soccer scholarship, was in school. was really struggling on the inside, like just hanging everything on by a thread. And what ended up taking place is I was in a psych class one day. I went to school for psychology, and somebody said to me, "Oh, your conscious mind can't outwill or overpower your subconscious mind." And as somebody who was kind of like a tortured soul from all of these experiences of telling myself I was going to stop and I was going to get clean and I was going to do these things, and then just repeating the behavior and feeling honestly so weak and like not capable of change and like what's wrong with me that I say I'm going to do this stuff and then I always repeat behaviors. That person in one sentence like explained to me like this the biggest challenge I'd ever been through in my life, and suddenly everything made sense. It was like, oh, so my conscious mind says I'm going to do these things, and my subconscious and unconscious mind have different ulterior motives. So I got like really obsessed with learning about the subconscious mind. So actually, while I was in school, and by the way, at this point in time, I had been to inpatient rehab and outpatient rehab. I had been to AA meetings, NA meetings, usually in the summers between school years, like, trying to figure it out and just not really being able to get it together. And so at this point in time, it was like, oh my gosh, like this is going to be the way out because this has the key to unlock a lot of this stuff. So I did like a in-depth hypnotherapy certification, started there, um, did NLP, all kinds of stuff at that point to really learn as years went on. And that was for me like how I got sober. And I'm definitely not saying that like that's what everybody should do. Like I do believe in structure and rehab and 12 steps for some people, all that kind of stuff. But for me, doing the inner work at a deep level to reprogram and recondition the baggage that I was carrying and like the woundedness that I had from childhood, that was why I was using painkillers, was to numb emotional pain. So by healing really deeply and doing a lot of that like work at a deeper level, that's how I was like able to live sober life and be really happy. But it took that work first. So it was definitely a journey. It wasn't like this overnight thing, but that's where I got really interested in this stuff. And eventually it circled back into client practice and then relationships for people.
That's incredible. I have a similar story too, as far as like working with hypnotherapy and NLP and all these things to help myself with getting over anxiety and depression in the past years. Like I was like 18, 17, and just had super bad panic attacks all the time, all that stuff. But I found those two in particular to be probably the most effective therapies for getting past that. And there was a few other things as well, but that's why I really like when people have the NLP background because it's so rapid. Like you still need to kind of go over all those things. You need like in many cases a therapist, someone to talk to bounce ideas off of, to kind of like see your blind spots, to kind of overcome things, and then to sort of shine a light on what to focus on. But as far as like rapid results,
Yeah.
NLP is one of the best things I've ever found. And like hypnosis, hypnotherapy, you can even do it by yourself too. Like a lot of people don't realize that you can actually just kind of like use an MP3 or whatever and like do these sessions over and over again. And like it just is literally training your subconscious mind to get over whatever, has been blocked there for a long time. So I love that like you have that background as well. And when it's coming from someone like you too, it's always like nice to see that it's not just like some woo-woo technique that's like self-help, like, oh yeah, like try hypnosis, like some kind of far off idea. It's like very grounded in science and really works.
And like the craziest thing is that I feel like we have this whole body of work in the world, and this is changing. So don't get me wrong, like this is transforming over time, but this whole body of work in the world is like, hey, let's do the Western world work and let's gain insight about ourselves and let's learn about our patterns and let's diagnose people and let's put them into these categories and then say you have this and now we have context for things. And to me, it's like, okay, that's a good first step is the awareness piece, but like what about the transformation? Like, and I remember being in this particular, it was an AA meeting at the time. And I was young, I was like 18 and a half. And I was in this meeting and I was sitting there and I remember this girl, she stood up and she like was 100 days sober and she's talking about it. And she was like, today was such a struggle. And I remember like sitting there being like, oh my gosh, am I going to struggle for the rest of my friggin' life? Like, is this going to be like, there's got to be a better way. Like, I can't go through this, like, because when you're in it, when you're like in addiction, it is like your biggest focus. Nothing else really matters. Like, that's just like it's all consuming. And I was like, I want to have like a life as a human, like before this happened. Like, I want to like go enjoy things and, and so I was like, there has to be another way. And so when I heard about this, it's so funny because like your conscious mind is responsible for like 3 to 5% of your beliefs, thoughts, emotions, actions. Your subconscious and unconscious collectively are 95 to 97%. So we have this whole model out in the world of like, let's gain insight into our behavior, let's diagnose people, but we don't have many therapies or therapeutic models that are tackling the subconscious mind. And so what I ended up doing is I ended up when I healed and was like, oh my gosh, I ended up like I was like 21 years old at the time, turning 22, and I went and started giving free workshops. I was like, nobody's talking about this. So I started going giving all these free workshops to people. Eventually, like a couple hundred people would show up, and I was like this kid being, telling people,
Oh,
pay attention to your subconscious mind. This is how it works. Because when I went into client practice and I would do these hypnosis sessions with people, I was like, it's kind of the give a man a fish rather than teach a man to fish
yeah.
dynamic, where you're like, I'll do it for you, come back, I'll see you in a week and I'll do it for you again. And I was like, people instead need to be educated about how their subconscious mind works so they can do the reprogramming themselves. So to your point earlier, like when you're like, yeah, you can, a lot of these things, you can do them yourself. Like that's what our programs do. It's personal development, all for the subconscious mind. Every course we have, everything you want to work on, all of it is about how to address these principles at the subconscious level to rewire your patterning. So you're not just doing the I'm going to gain insight piece and see where these things come from. I'm then going to actually have tools to transform by leveraging principles of neuroplasticity and subconscious reprogramming.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so you have a PhD too as well in this?
Yeah, not
What?
in this.
Well,
And
I
I went
mean,
down the hypnotherapy. I honestly got really interested in like three different spaces. I was interested in like the scientific part of things and definitely went in like the formal education route for that reason. I was really interested in the spiritual side of things. A lot of my healing came from like a relationship to God. And like a lot of it more in like a Buddhist way. Like I was really into meditation, all these different things. And then I went into the more like one-off side of things like hypnotherapy, NLP, different certifications. So my PhD is in pastoral counseling,
wow,
really that like spiritual side of things, and then wanted to have more of the like I've always been really interested about where like psychology, science, and spirituality all overlap and kind of meet there. And so I kind of went in all these different branches to figure out how those things overlap together.
that's awesome. That explains that explains why you're so optimistic too as well.
Maybe. I hope that's why.
That's cool though. That's such a good mix of different backgrounds and putting it all together does give you a very unique perspective on things and I don't know, it's pretty cool to see it all kind of flow together and how it all works for you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a really, really exciting journey.
Yeah, it makes you super interesting too. And so as far as the attachment style itself though, because I know this is like a huge topic, especially in relationships, obviously, especially people, and I don't know what the exact divorce rate is now, but it's like something like 50% or so in the US,
Yeah, like
probably similar,
55.
yeah,
Yeah,
55 in Canada. Do you find that attachment styles, like when people have a relationship, that it's one of the biggest factors as far as a successful relationship versus a non-successful one?
100%. If I had to say the factor that's affecting our relationships the most, it's this. And there's a reason why. It's not just like at a surface level. So like if you think of your attachment style, and maybe for listeners who don't know, I'll go
I was
into
just
like
about to say, probably a better question to start would be, what is an attachment style?
so the way I like to think of it in a very simplified manner is like it's your subconscious set of rules you've learned about how to give and receive love. So everything that we get repetitively exposed to, the repetition and emotion of things fires and wires neural pathways, right? So we get repeatedly exposed to things and they program us. And so when you think of how your childhood goes, really up until the age of 8, we're producing mostly alpha and theta brainwaves as children. So we're in like a hypersuggestible state, which means those like parts of our programming are taking really they're building deep roots very quickly in a very deep way. So a lot of like the early rules we learn about love and connection and like what that should look like, what relationships should look like, and not just romantically, like friendships, family, everything is from the modeling we have in the household. And so we get modeled a whole bunch of different things, but essentially if you look at securely attached kids, a child, so there's 4 attachment styles. One is securely attached. That's like what we want to be. Research showed that, a couple decades ago it was about 50% of the population. More current research is showing that's on the decline. Then you have 3 insecure styles. You have your anxious, preoccupied attachment style. You can just think of anxious attachment style, dismissive avoidant, and then fearful avoidant. And that's sometimes referred to as disorganized attachment style. So there's 3 insecure and 1 secure. Secure kids, all of their programming growing up, all the repetitive rules they're exposed to about love, is they get a lot of approach-oriented behaviors from caregivers. So like if they cry as children, the parent goes towards them, tries to figure out what's wrong, tries to understand what's happening, tries to soothe them. And so from a very young age, they're actually getting conditioned or programmed to believe Emotions are safe to express. It's safe to rely on other people. If I open up and do try to express my needs, they're going to get validated and most likely met. And so I can rely on other people and I can trust them. And as a result of that, because a child also gets love given to them through these approach-oriented behaviors, they also feel worthy of love. So they feel more confident and they have an easier time because all of this is their conditioning growing up, or the vast majority of it. They have a much easier time relating to and developing relationships with other people. And so statistically, securely attached kids grow up to be securely attached adults and have the most successful relationships overall. Then you have your three insecure styles who get totally different modeling. So, like your anxious attachment style gets a lot of modeling that basically says, we're very loving, we love you, but a lot of times that love is taken away in some form. So it could be, for example, one parent's really warm and one's cold, and that inconsistency is confusing. Or it could be things like both parents are loving, but the parents work very long hours. And so the child's constantly with the grandparents or the babysitter or the after school programs. So they have positive associations to love that they get conditioned with. Love is good, love is safe, I want love and connection, but it's constantly taken away. So it's like, but I'm going to be abandoned at any time. So the anxious attachment style grows up to be an adult who's terrified of abandonment. And they constantly get afraid of being abandoned, excluded, disliked, rejected, very sensitive to people dynamics. And as a result of this, they become clingy and needy in their relationships. And of course, that often pushes people away. So it becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. On the very flip side of that, you have your dismissive avoidant. Dismissive avoidant attachment styles grow up with the overarching theme being childhood emotional neglect. So oftentimes, if you look at CEN or childhood emotional neglect, it's very covert. Food's on the table, dinner's ready, kids are in school on time. But if the child expresses their emotions, they're shamed or dismissed or ignored. And usually they get the opposite of approach-oriented behaviors. So if a child, especially when they're really young, is crying, is sad, the parent kind of like turns away or says, come on, stop being fussy, or go into the other room. We don't have, children should be seen and not heard. And so all of this modeling they get is like, okay, this part of me is not worthy of love, is not acceptable. And so they grow up to basically reject and deny their own emotions and that part of themselves, which when you really attach to somebody and you really build feelings in a relationship with somebody, it's very vulnerable, right? Your feelings turn on, like you feel all of that stuff. And so dismissive avoidant adults, as soon as they feel too attached, they sabotage. They usually push away, stonewall, ice out, run in the other direction, fear commitment, because they're actually scared of surfacing that part of themselves that they're so deeply trying to bury and repress because of the negative programmed associations from childhood. The very last attachment style is the fearful avoidant. Fearful avoidant is sometimes referred to as disorganized. Fearful avoidant is what I actually was. So usually fearful avoidance is characterized by like a chaotic childhood. So you can see things like having a parent with like a personality disorder, or a lot of mental health issues, a parent who's like an alcoholic or addict, or both parents perhaps, or if there's like a lot of fighting, a lot of chaos, really bad divorce. And essentially what happens is you operate through like love and connection in extreme polarities. So you have some really positive experiences with love and connection, but some really terrifying experiences with love and connection. And it's like you never know what you're going to get. So, you can look at like a really obvious example would be if somebody has a parent who's an alcoholic, and let's say it's the mother. One day mom comes home, she's drinking, she's in a really nice mood, she's really loving. Another day mom comes home, she's drinking and she's cruel and she's angry. Another day mom's sobering up and she's in a terrible mood because she's going through, withdrawals and having a terrible time. Another day she's been sober for a little bit and she's very kind because she feels terribly about her behavior. It's like you never know what version of mom you're going to get. And so you can sort of see that in like if it's a cluster B personality disorder parent, like a narcissist, or if you have instead parents who are fighting all the time, like, oh, or is the fight going to break out? I'm walking on eggshells. So fearful avoidance grow up not really trusting. They don't really trust like the environment. They tend to sort of have dynamics around like always waiting for the other shoe to drop. And they share both the anxious side of the attachment spectrum and the dismissive avoidant. So they have the abandonment wounds and fears, but they also get really afraid of being trapped and committed in the wrong relationship and love or connection going south and going down a bad path. So fearful avoidance as adults become very hot and cold in relationships. They're like, come here, get close. And then somebody gets closer, like, this is too close, get back. And so they're very hot and cold and back and forth, which is obviously confusing to people on the receiving end of that. So those are the four major attachment styles and a little bit how they form and some of the symptoms.
That's awesome. This is really like one of the most interesting topics to me. I love this topic. It because it really speaks to the nature of human beings and, how we become the adults we become. Because like you said, all this is really shaped in early childhood. And it's kind of sad in a lot of ways because, a lot of adults who become these types of people that we're talking about have a lot of problems later on in life. They really had no choice. It wasn't like they chose to be, a bad person and they chose to commit crime or be an alcoholic or, drug addict or whatever, or bad in relationships, or they're just like always sabotaging themselves. But it's really it's fascinating to see, um, the different perspectives and the different ways that people turn out.
Yeah.
So real quickly, and you said you were fearful avoidant. Do you think that that contributed to your addiction later on when you were in your like 15 or
Course.
so?
100%.
Eh,
I think that that was almost like the peak of all of the attachment issues, especially because in like a developmental phase around like 12, 13, we start to individuate. And it's like if you don't have a safe center in yourself and you don't have a safe center in your home, like I think there's this internal world of chaos that usually peaks for people around their like mid-teens. And so for me, for sure, that was the result. That was like the effect of all this unprocessed stuff. And that's like actually what really helped me heal is to really realize at one point, like me using opiates is like a symptom of unprocessed, unresolved things that are much deeper. And I don't believe very much in treating symptoms. Like, yes, sometimes there's a time and place to treat symptoms. Like, yes, put a band-aid on things if you're bleeding, but like you actually have to go in and stitch that cut up at the same time. And so I'm a big root cause person, and I got really interested in that. And that to me was so much of what the subconscious represented. It's like we can dig into what's really going on here, what root cause is, and if you heal that, the surface symptoms change, and they're so much easier to move through.
that's fascinating. In your experience, though, do you think people like just say, and do you mind sharing? If it's too much, that's fine. But do you mind sharing why you had a chaotic childhood, why you became a fearful avoidant? Just super quick. Like, was there a big thing that people can kind of look at
Yeah, I would say, I mean, I want to be like a little
without,
mindful of
yeah,
parent
without
privacy.
diving into much? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't mind sharing for a personal perspective, but I do want to be respectful of both my parents because they still are actually like back and forth in divorce court, and it's been like however like 20 years.
Oh,
They
wow.
just, to say the very least, they brought out very difficult parts of each other, and there was a lot of chaos and a lot of like and extreme chaos. Like I would put that chaos number very, very high, and very consistent chaos. So I just don't think I ever really knew what it meant to like be able to trust or have stability in my home. And oftentimes, one thing that for sure I can share is that I was very parentified. So I would be, they both kind of unloaded on me a lot. And of course, like I grew up hearing one story from one parent and then the totally different story from another parent. And they would both be like, well, your father's lying, your mother's lying. And then the fights would be very intense. So then I would have to make sure my sister was safe and, just a lot of chaotic things. And so, and I'd always worry about my little sister and like, so I kind of was like in this protector role, but also in this like, I never knew what I was gonna get. I never knew like what version of them was gonna come out. And like they're both really good people, like loving people, but they just both had like so many wounds and like so much to work through. They both came from, particularly one of my parents came through a lot of extreme childhood trauma. And so, like they had their own stuff they were carrying in, and trauma is contagious in its own way. It gets
Oh,
passed
yeah.
down by wherever we're in proximity to somebody. So um I think just a lot of that spilled onto me. And I think at a very young age, like I was in the middle of everything. And so there was a lot of that like back and forth and confusion.
Totally makes sense. And well, it's good to see you broke the cycle. But
Thank
do you think if you had been, say, in a secure attachment instead of the fearful avoidant one, do you think you might have had the same addiction or no?
Absolutely not. Yeah, like
Wow, it's that
yeah,
powerful
there's
then.
100%. I mean,
Wow.
there's this old like saying, and I think that there's a lot more to this saying as well, but the genetics loads the gun, environment pulls the trigger. And I think like, yes, we have a genetic predisposition to things. I actually did have like alcoholism run in my family. They say it skips a generation. It was in my grandparents, like that kind of stuff makes sense. But like, there's no way that even epigenetics now kind of disproves that that's the only factor that makes a big enough difference in somebody's life. And I just think in a really big way, we get conditioned with painful things, right? We develop. So I'll share from a personal experience for people to understand this. So when I started healing, the first thing I focused on was core wounds. I discovered like 5 major areas of healing that helped me become securely attached. So the first thing was core wounds. So when we go through traumatic events, we give things meaning. The subconscious mind, like we're seeking certainty because certainty equals survival, right? So we go through painful events that we can't process, we give it meaning and we store it. And that storage becomes part of our identity. So for myself personally, a huge belief I had is like, I can't trust, right? Like, I don't know who's lying, who's telling the truth. I can't trust. I'm going to be betrayed. And I had lots of experiences of betrayal. So I had this huge core wound. Well, when I take that wound and I believe in that, or I think I'm going to be abandoned, or I'm going to be trapped, or I'm going to be all the things, right? Then what happens is that becomes a belief, right? A core wound is a belief pattern that we get exposed to long enough, it becomes a part of our wiring. So then that belief becomes part of my identity. It's wired into my own subconscious mind. I take it with me everywhere I go. So I start to build, relationships as a teenager, for example, and I'm expecting betrayal or being trapped or all the things that I'm taking out from my childhood. Belief patterns create patterns of thought. So, if you imagine like a belief is like a tree trunk, the thought patterns are the tree branches. So if somebody has a core belief of like, I'm not good enough, just as an example, they have thought patterns that follow that belief. So I'm not smart enough, interesting enough, funny enough, attractive enough, you name it, I'm not something enough. So we have thought patterns that thread out from those beliefs. When we're thinking and believing those things, how do we feel? Well, we feel insecure or sad or afraid. So beliefs lead to thoughts, lead to emotions. Your emotions are made up of neurochemical reactions. So if I have a lot of positively oriented thoughts, I'm going to have more serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin. If I have a lot of negatively oriented thoughts, I'm going to have more cortisol, norepinephrine. Talk about like how antidepressants treat chemical imbalances. Well, your neurochemistry is being very much influenced by your patterns of thought and belief all day, every day. Like the University of Southern California's Neuroimaging Institute says we think roughly 70,000 thoughts per day. So those are all kinds of neurochemical reactions taking place. Then neuroscience proceeded to prove, a scientist named Antonio Damasio, that every single decision we make as people is based on our emotional state. So people who are like, I'm so logical and rational, no, you're making emotionally based decisions at your tipping point, and then you're just quick to rationalize or justify it through logic. So I give people this acronym, BTEA, right? Your beliefs lead to thoughts, to emotions, to actions. So if you imagine that for me, I have all these core wounds and beliefs, right? I'm not good enough. I'm unworthy. I'm going to be betrayed. I can't trust. I'm unlovable. I'm unsafe. All these core beliefs from the experiences I had in my childhood that got wired in through repetition over time. Now, my first time I sat down in meditation, okay, I had somebody say, oh, you have to observe your subconscious mind when I was learning about it. I said, I went to sit down. This is like the most visceral experience. I went to sit down in meditation for my first time, and I'm like closing my eyes, and I'm like, very young. And I'm like, I have no idea what I'm doing. I sit down and I'm supposed to observe my thoughts. And right away, I start thinking thoughts. And I'm like, I'll never be able to do this. This is stupid. I can't do anything. Why am I bothering? I'm never going to get sober. I'm going to be a failure at life. And I'm watching my thoughts for the first time. I'm always just in them before, right? Identified with them. This is the first time I'm ever even like trying to like consciously observe. And I'm like, oh my God, no wonder I numb myself all day. This is what I'm numbing, right? I'm escaping and numbing this like this part of myself that's following me around all day, right? It's really just my conditioning. But my internal dialogue all day is attacking myself. If you had somebody following you around talking to you like that all day, you would want to numb them and escape from them too. So for me, it was this like profound realization as one of those first 5 things that I worked on. We can talk about some of the other ones, but like, oh my gosh, I have to reprogram these patterns of thought and core wounds because they're making me feel like shit emotionally. And then they're putting me in a space where I'm needing to numb and escape myself as a coping mechanism for everything that's taking place in my internal world first.
Wow. That's all right. So I want to actually try to go through as many of them as possible. Can we list them out though, in case we can't get to all of them?
The core wounds are the different pillars of healing.
The 5 pillars of healing, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Core wounds, reprogramming. We can talk about tools to reprogram them too. Needs, okay, huge thing. So just like we have BTEA, beliefs and thought patterns lead to emotions and actions. Unmet needs will also lead to emotional output. They're the two only reasons we have emotional pain or suffering. Pain is unmet needs, right? If I move to a new country and I don't speak the language and I have a big need for connection because I love people, even though, I am in a new country and maybe my life was great right before that, I'm going to feel a little bit of pain because I'm going to feel my need for emotional connection is not getting met because I'm in a new country with a whole bunch of people that I don't speak the language. Pain is actually good in that case. It's prodding me to go pivot, adapt, and evolve, right? Go make new friends, go learn the language. But when we don't know that we have unmet needs, we just feel chronic emotional pain, which means chronic, more negative neurochemical reactions and balance versus imbalance. And then we have more coping mechanisms. Because remember, emotions lead to action. Neuroscience has proven we all make emotionally based decisions or take emotionally based actions. So first thing, belief patterns, right? Rewire. Second thing, learn your needs and how to meet them, because it will actually keep you in a much better emotional state. And there's some frameworks to use to do that. Third thing, emotional regulation from a nervous system point of view. So another thing I did a lot of work on was actually regulating my nervous system. I spent a lot of time in sympathetic growing up, fight or flight, ready to go, what's going to happen, high alert. Really had to get into parasympathetic. And I just did a lot of meditation, honestly, to get used to that. And that put me in a more like centered state. I felt like I was back in my body. I was more in touch with my emotions. So core wounds, needs, emotions, boundaries. Okay, I was a very boundaryless person. My own patterns is very fearful avoidant for anybody who might listen to this and be like, I'm the fearful avoidant too. I had really bad boundaries, and my relationship to boundaries is I would be boundaryless. I would say yes to everything because in childhood I get pretty badly punished if I didn't agree with things. And so boundaries to me meant I'm going to be unsafe and punished. I had to rewire that concept in myself. And so boundaries, I would have this thing where I'd be like boundaryless and people please until I'd get so frustrated and mad. And then I would be like, and I would get really angry and tell people how I really felt. And it was like, that's not healthy boundary setting. Like healthy boundary setting is like in real time from a regulated, assertive place, not from a place of anger 2 months later. So rewiring your boundaries, and then for your relationship to boundaries, last but not least, changing how you learn to communicate. You know, sometimes we feel like we can't communicate or share our needs or speak up with people. And like, if we can't do that, then we're gonna have a really hard time functioning in relationships. And so those became like 5 cornerstones of healing your attachment style. It was actually work I did first on myself, then got into client practice, started doing work in client practice, then revisited attachment theory partway through client practice and realized each attachment style has their own unique core wounds, their own unique needs, their own unique emotional patterns, their own unique communication and boundary issues or patterns. And so once I knew someone's attachment style, I could target exactly what those things would be with somebody after doing this work myself, and then help them rewire those 5 major areas, and they would then become securely attached. So we're undoing that wiring. For me, I didn't do it first in that context. I did it in the context of like, let me get sober and did the core wounds, the needs, the emotional patterns. But what I learned later is that in personal, interpersonal relationships, how to communicate and have healthy boundaries. And then it came full circle.
That's incredible. I love these 5 steps too, and we're gonna dive into them in a moment. Real quickly though, you were so adamant when I asked you if you would have had secure attachment, would you have not been addicted to the drugs for the number of years that you were? Do you think that everybody, because I'm from a place I told you before we jumped on, Taunton, which is about 30 miles or so south of Boston, and for some reason it's one of the, I don't know if like factually it is, but as far as I know it is one of the most prevalent places in the state and probably in the country with this opioid epidemic, where like there's so many people I went to high school with within a few years and in my class that have been addicted to drugs now for the last 15 years. And I can't 30, 40, 50 people I know personally that are now dead because of overdoses, because they start with the Percocets, they start with the Vicodins and then graduate into heroin soon after
Yeah,
because heroin's cheaper, it's easier to get.
exactly.
But like there's been so many deaths with in my town, and so many people like currently, like you see them every once in a while like in the store, grocery store, whatever, and you just you know they're on drugs, you're hooked on drugs, and it's sad. But I'm just wondering, like, did all those people in your best estimation, do you think they all came from an attachment style where it wasn't secure?
I would say vast majority. There's basically a couple things, right? What takes a person from insecurely attached to, or from securely attached, which is the ideal, to insecurely attached? First big thing is core wounds. So somebody technically, right, can be securely attached all the way through their childhood, get into a relationship when they're like, let's say 15, 20 years old, and be in an abusive relationship. And because we have neuroplasticity and we get rewired by events, could then come out of that relationship insecurely attached. So our childhood is the main place where we form our attachment style, but we can have different experiences that are wounding our interpersonal dynamics and making us insecurely attached. If you have a secure person, generally securely attached people have, in terms of those five pillars, almost all of them going for them, right? So they have way less core wounds. And if they do have any core wounds, like let's say you have a really secure household, but let's say this kid gets bullied for half a year in sixth grade, they might have like an I'm not good enough core wound, but it's not going to be like the child who grew up in a household with the parents constantly saying you're not good enough and being, maybe they're both alcoholics and they're abusive in their language. Like you're just going to have a scale of difference in terms of the depth of the wound because of how much repetition and emotion fired and wired. So, and how deep that wound becomes as a result. So you're going to have less core wounds. You're going to have a person who knows their needs better. Securely attached people generally know their needs and have them met, who can communicate clearly, who's in parasympathetic nervous system mode, and who's in a place where like they can have healthy boundaries and talk things through with people. So people generally, when they're operating functionally, when they have these five things going for them, you don't want to numb yourself. What is there to numb? Life feels good. So you could have, by technicality, somebody who's securely attached has a traumatic experience in some way later in adulthood, doesn't know how to deal with that trauma, and then goes to cope through drugs or alcohol. And you could definitely have that. But the vast majority of the time, you're going to have people who end up, especially if you're addicted at a young age to something, chances are very high that you're going to have people who are insecurely attached, have a lot of unresolved wounds, a lot of unmet needs. Their internal world's a painful place to be. And so, of course, we numb and we try to escape ourselves.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was going to ask you too, and then you kind of jumped into the five core pillars, which is incredible. But one of my initial questions was going to be, is it possible, which I kind of know the answer to, but is it possible to get out of an attachment style that was developed at an early age, which you answered, of course it is. But I didn't know that, which makes perfect sense now that you explain it though, that you could go from a secure to an unsecure one. And personally, I actually used to be anxious from, you know, just kind of going over the facts of like what each one was. I was definitely more of the anxious type, the ancient attachment style. But I think just simply dealing with the things I've had in the past in my own life was a blessing in disguise because it actually made me kind of resolve a lot of this stuff that I didn't know I was resolving. And then I come out of it in a secure attachment now, which is pretty cool.
Exactly. And like you said, I think before we started like talking for the podcast part, like you said you did a lot of work from NLP and hypnosis and
Yeah.
like work through anxiety and depression, or maybe that was when we did start recording.
Yeah, I
But
think
but
it
it
was.
shows, but that would be a really good way that this happens, right? Because through a lot of that like hypnosis, NLP, you're probably learning more about who you are and so your needs, but more importantly, you're rewiring different wounds and different patterns that might have programmed you. And so that's shifting and changing the core wounds and the needs. As a result, you're probably feeling more emotionally regulated. So things that you're doing that deep inner work, especially at a subconscious level, is rewiring you to be in a more secure space.
Definitely. Yeah. It's like kind of like it gave me the tools that I didn't know I needed for like other things in life. Like I was able to like fix this issue, which was causing a lot of problems. And then like once I fixed it, now I'm like at a higher place than I would have been if I just like never had the issue, which is pretty cool.
And I really believe that. Like, I really believe every time we have emotional pain or suffering, it's actually really good feedback. Like, it's supposed to be there happening to us and supporting us for a reason, right? Like, it's giving you feedback about two things all the time, and that's it. And this is like people have their emotions and they think, like, I should scroll on social media or I should binge television or I should eat food or drink wine or whatever it is, like to escape themselves. But your emotions are actually doing a great service to you 24/7. They're just always telling you either you have an unmet need, hey, pay attention, go get your need met. They're like poking at you, or you're being really crappy to yourself in your internal dialogue. You're telling the story of how nobody's going to hire you or nobody's going to love you or whatever it might be. And of course, you're going to feel bad. So they're giving you a perfect amount of like mirrored feedback into yourself. So you can either change your thought patterns or you can realize, oh, there's something missing from my life. Let me go investigate what that is and go strategize for how to get it met. And now my emotions, which are just a feedback mechanism, resolve as a result of using them as what they're meant for.
100%. I've said it before too, even like depression is horrible as it is, and I've had like the worst of it. It actually is a sign that something like you need to change something. Like it can actually be the catalyst to something incredible. Like for instance, someone who's had like a job that they hate for the last 5 years and then they develop depression all of a sudden and it seems to come out of nowhere. It's literally saying like, dude, you're literally wasting your life. Pick something because you got to do something you actually enjoy. Like in many cases, depression is actually a good catalyst to propel you to actually do something good and make a big change.
Absolutely. I like literally couldn't agree more with that. And I think that I think with depression specifically, there's a physiological component to it to some degree, which is like, I don't think it's just a genetic predisposition, because I think a lot of people can have that. But I do think there's like people who have methylation issues or thyroid issues or gut
Yeah,
health issues. And there can be that too to figure out. But if you just like sit in the moment with when you're depressed, you're depressed because you're thinking thoughts that are making you depressed, or you have totally unmet needs and you have to go pay attention to that, right? So you're getting this emotional feedback. Sure, there's the physiological component with that in that particular case, but in the moment you feel bad, it's because you're thinking thoughts or having unmet needs. And so you have this really important dynamic of like, hey, like this is a feedback mechanism. It's there if people use it for what it's meant for. Not everybody does what you did, right? So unfortunately and tragically, some people are like, I just feel terrible. They get stuck in learned helplessness. They don't even realize they're thinking terrible thoughts that hurt them. And they don't realize that they have all these unmet needs and they don't introspect about them. And so then they feel learned helpless and miserable. And then unfortunately, sometimes we rely on outside sources for things to try to solve for that may not actually solve the problem.
100%. Absolutely agree. And as far as what I mentioned, like in the beginning, I think of the episode, when it comes to different attachment styles, like in a relationship, when somebody has like now you have a secure attachment style, but I'm sure, or just say for instance, like hypothetically, when you met your husband now and you had your fearful avoidance still, and he had say a secure one,
He was
how would
dismissive avoidant.
was he what?
Dismissive avoidant.
Oh, he was there. Okay. So, all right. So what, I mean, if you don't mind sharing, then how did you guys navigate the fact that you kind of both had different attachment styles and, where you're at today?
Yeah, it's a great
How
question.
does anybody navigate having different ones too?
Yeah, such a good question. So the first thing was that like I do have to say before I met him, I'd done a lot of self-work. So I did a lot of core wound reprogramming. I would have said so you can have technically have like a secondary style. So you can have like one like somebody can be mostly secure, but they can have some anxious wounding and like, lean a little anxious as an example. So for me, by the time I met him, I've been in like intensive work and actually already working in client practice for a little bit of time. And I was definitely probably 50% secure at that point because I'd done a lot of core wound work, a lot of learning about myself, how to meet my own needs. I had a more regulated nervous system. So, and for him, he had done a good bit of work before we met as well. So he was probably like maybe like 60 or 70% DA, and then, had some security in there too. So the first thing, when you look at relationships, they're interdependent, right? So it's not, people have these really like polarized views a lot of the time where hey, we're in a relationship. I'm just going to meet all your needs. You're just going to meet all my needs. We'll never meet our own or self-soothe. We'll just out. It's like we're farming out our needs from each other all the time. And that's dysfunctional. That becomes codependency because if I have to only ever rely on somebody to meet my needs and I'm disempowered in the relationship to myself, there's going to be human moments where the person doesn't mind read what your need is or misses something or makes a mistake or forgets it. And if they're your only main source of getting your needs met, it's going to be a really big deal. But like securely attached people, they'll know how to meet their own needs too, or communicate their needs to multiple healthy people in their life. So if somebody doesn't show up in the way they expected, they either just course correct the person and have a conversation, or they go source their needs from themselves or someone else. So what we're looking for is not codependency, and we're not looking for the opposite, which is counterdependency. People who are like, don't rely on me. I'm going to keep taking space and like keeping everyone at arm's length. And they're also scared to rely on people, right? So we want the middle ground, which is like, I can meet my own needs and I can also communicate and lean on you to meet my needs. And so there's this like reciprocity, right? So for me, by the time I met him, there's definitely like the other thing I'll say is relationships go through 6 stages. So relationships go through a dating stage, a honeymoon stage, a power struggle stage, marked usually at a year and a half or so into a relationship, statistically where most relationships end. And then if you make it through the power struggle, you go stability, commitment, bliss stages. So in the beginning
What's
stage,
okay?
yeah.
Can I just stop you for one sec? We don't have to get like super into it, but what does the power struggle look like? What's that stage look like?
So usually you're dating and honeymoon. Dating's usually 4 to 6 months. Sometimes like people will commit a little earlier, but it's you go from dating to honeymoon once you make a commitment. Okay. So then people get into some kind of commitment. Even in like polyamorous relationships, they, make each other a primary focus or whatever it might be. There's some sort of commitment. Then they go dating to honeymoon. Honeymoon's like our rose-colored glasses. Once we get comfortable enough with somebody, we let our mask down a little bit. We let our guard down. We show more of our flaws and our fears. And generally that actually is what kicks off and triggers the power struggle stage. The power struggle stage is marked by more fighting, more arguing, a lot more conflict. And that's usually where people will end relationships. And what people don't realize is like it's happening for a reason. We get out of the power struggle stage by learning to like communicate through problems and challenges, by learning to open up and actually share about our fears and concerns rather than like keep them close to ourselves and never say, hey, I need reassurance around this thing, or hey, I feel unclear about this thing. Can we hash it out? If we don't learn to communicate properly, we won't make it out of the power struggle. And then if we do make it through, we get into the stability stage, which lasts for a little bit. We get used to understanding each other's wounds and fears. And then if we make it through that, we get into commitment and then bliss stages. The bliss stage is like the honeymoon stage, but you actually know each other, like each other's deep wounds and fears and needs. And you naturally know how to take those things into consideration because you've done the work to get there. So it's funny because a lot of people, I think, who don't get out of a power struggle stage, which was me before my husband and all these relationships before, you think that relationships are either like dating and honeymoon, like this peak of infatuation, or power struggle, like the fighting and arguing. And then the relationship blows up, and then you're like, oh, I have to start back again to the dating. And you think that that is the relationship life cycle. But in fact, there's way more to a relationship that gets much richer and deeper after you get out of the power struggle. So anyway, so I'll go back to that thing I was saying. So um, what we ended up doing was we ended up having a power struggle for sure. We started living together like a year and a half in, and I saw his avoidant stuff come out, and it kicked off some of my fearful avoidance stuff. And we definitely had like our things to work through. And for me, it was actually really scary for me at the time because I hadn't done this. I did a lot of deep self work, but I hadn't done a lot of the interpersonal work yet. And for me, that meant being vulnerable. That meant saying things like, hey, this actually hurts me when ABC happens, or hey, if so, like little things, right? Sometimes he'd be dismissive. Like sometimes I come home from work and I'd be like, hey, how was your day? And he'd be like doing something, he'd be like, oh, it's fine, not like pay attention. And that would like hurt me a little bit. Like that didn't land well. Now, me as a fearful avoidant at the time, or having that fearful avoidant part in there, I'd be like, that was rude. And I would like hold it and I'd be like, fine, I'm just gonna like, he wants to come talk to me in 5 minutes. I'm gonna be just like that back. And it was this like reactivity. And, knowing what I knew about this stuff, I was like, that's not gonna work. So what I had to learn to do, which was really scary for me because I wasn't good at being vulnerable in a really open, honest way before that. And he was really great about it and also reciprocated this, is I learned to go and say, hey, you may not think it's a big deal, but when I come home and I'm like excited to talk about our day and share and connect, I really need you to be present for a minute. If you're in the middle of something, finish what you're doing, but I need you to come, like stand up, give me a hug, like let's talk about our day for a minute and like have a warm exchange because it feels very cold and it feels really uncomfortable for me to not have that. And like I take it personally, like it makes me feel like I'm like not important. So I learned to like those wounds that I was still cleaning up, like I am unimportant, poor wound, or things like that. I learned I had to do that work on those wounds. But while in process, I also have to be vulnerable to share that with somebody that I care about and share that, hey, your actions affect me. And it was almost like I think me doing that gave him permission to do the same. And, I didn't realize for me, sometimes I'd be really critical with my words because I'd hold things in, right? So instead of saying like, hey, I need you to be present, it doesn't land well with me if you're, not present when I come in. Instead of, I learned that later, but originally I would just be like, that was rude. And then maybe later on, I'd be like, it's so rude when I come in and you don't even like say anything. And, it would come out in like frustration or hostility. And for him, dismissive avoidance, like one of their biggest wounds is criticism. They're so sensitive to criticism. And so he learned to say back, like, I also don't like when you talk like that. Like when you say like, oh, you're rude or you're this, like that doesn't land well with me. And so I had to take accountability for those things. But it's funny because whatever you have to work on in a relationship, each attachment style's work with each other is exactly what they need to heal. So I needed to learn to be a more vulnerable person and share, hey, I feel hurt when this happens, or hey, this feels bad when this happens. This is what I'm needing from you. And me doing that was exactly what he needed to feel more open in the relationship and to be able to feel safer and be present. So it's almost like each of the things we need to work on as individuals also happen to mirror into us what our own healing journey is that then benefits the relationship. So, and there's a few versions of that, honestly. Like I also had to learn to communicate my needs a lot because I would still people please a little too much. And then I would feel taken advantage of and then frustrated. And I had to learn to communicate my needs more. He was like a mirror for me into that. So we'll have all these little like rites of passage to making it through the power struggle stage, which heal us and the relationship at the same time.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love the dynamic of you guys working together on it and figuring it out. And so like when you're bringing this stuff, did you know exactly at the time like when you're talking about like these specific scenarios, do you recall exactly at the time of knowing like your attachment styles and knowing like how to figure it out, or was it more so just like you having an intuitive idea of like how like something was off and like you yourself going through all this work in the past for your own good knew you had to kind of address it and that kind of developed into what it did.
Yeah, so it's such a good question. So I the work I was doing originally was just all on like people it came from like my journey of like sobriety. Like it came from me learning about core wounds, needs, emotional regulation. That was like I super focused on that. I was actually in client practice helping people work on those things at a subconscious level because I had done all this healing and that was my work. And I hadn't done relationship oriented work. And it was funny because I did all this like self work to be really like healed within me, like soothe myself, know how to take care of myself, all that kind of stuff. But I didn't do the vulnerability work yet. And what happened is I was like in client practice, working with people, I started living with him. He went from like being really warm and open and in the dating and honeymoon stage, what usually our attachment style shows up the most in the power struggle, to suddenly we were living together and I felt like he became this cold person. And as soon as he became cold, I became more reactive. And I hadn't been like that much either until that point. And I was like, what is going on? And so actually because of that, I went back, I had learned about attachment styles in like first year university psych class. And it's very high level. It's like, oh yeah, your attachment style and how it affects you. And I went back and I looked at that stuff again. And I realized like, okay, I'm for sure the hot and cold one. And he's for sure the more avoided one, where he's more like he's less hot and cold. He's more just kind of cold a lot when he's in that space. And I was like, oh wow, like this is so interesting. And when I started to then research attachment styles more, I found that all the work I've been doing on the subconscious mind, the fearful avoidant has very specific core wounds. They're different from the dismissive avoidant. They're different from the anxious attachment style. So I started bringing that into client practice, being like, oh, I was doing all this research about attachment theory and then realizing all these things I was already working on with people, the core wounds, the needs, the emotional regulation, they actually fit really neatly into the categories of each attachment style. And so I was some of it was intuitive because I knew about other things and I was kind of bridging like worlds together from like CBT, core wounds, hypnosis, and the subconscious mind into like relationships, but they actually merged together in a really good way. And that helped me do a lot of work in practicing that relationship, understanding those dynamics. And then the fearful avoidant has the anxious side. So you can really relate to the anxious side and you can really relate to the avoidance side. So I think you get like a fuller idea of the attachment spectrum as a fearful avoidant. You're like, I know what it's like to be either one kind of in a sense.
Yeah.
So that helped too. But that was actually a catalyst to then go into the work of attachment theory.
Yeah. And then so of course, obviously you need a partner who's willing to do the work as well, right? Like so the other question too, and I know we got to wrap things up probably like what 5, 10 minutes
Yeah,
maybe.
yeah,
All
five,
right.
10 minutes is good. Yeah.
So I'm gonna try to get this. And like I said, I'd love to get you back on because there's so many other questions. Like we've only like touched the surface on some of the things, but every time you bring something up, I get like five more questions I want to ask, and I'm trying
Good.
to stay on topic as much as possible. But so like say you were a secure attachment, and you had already like fulfilled, you get to the 100% level, you kind of already did the work, and you kind of like, because you said you were kind of in the process, maybe 50-50 or so, you're still dealing with your issues. But say you were 100% secure, and then your partner was dismissive, avoidant, or one of the other ones, an anxious type, or negative, sort of type. How do you bring it up? Because it seems like it's easier when you're both sort of in the same place where you're both sort of dealing in a sense, because you can kind of relate to, all right, we both have to do work on this. But if you're already there and your partner isn't there, how do you how do you navigate those oceans where like it could be a lot trickier of it seeming like you're just kind of bringing them down all the time and you're like, well, you got to get to my level, like you got to fix yourself, you got to work on yourself. How do you do that?
It's such a good question. So generally what's really interesting is that, and this is going to go down another rabbit hole, but generally what's really interesting is like securely attached people are most attracted to securely attached people.
Wow.
Why? Because we're most attracted to our subconscious comfort zone. Okay. It's like one of the biggest
Yeah.
of three things that actually drives attraction at a subconscious level is what's familiar. So, what is the most familiar? It's the relationship we have to ourselves. So, interestingly enough, securely attached people are in a secure relationship to self. So when somebody is insecurely attached, like if they're a little insecurely attached, but a lot majority secure, they might be in that relationship and show up and be present. There's two other factors that also affect attraction that we can always come back to. But it's really that familiar zone is what we're gonna both most be attracted to. So interestingly enough, anxious and anxious are almost never together. Dismissive and dismissive are almost never together because anxious people are in a dismissive avoidant relationship to themselves. They're people pleasing everybody. They're so focused on everybody else. Dismissives are anxiously preoccupied with their own time and space. Oh, I need time alone. I need space. I need. So they end up often being in relationships together because that may have the anxious and avoidant side. They can kind of go either way. But what ends up happening is usually what you'll see with a securely attached person, and I can tell you this having been secure for like a decade now, is that if somebody came to me and I really liked them, and maybe I was like, if I was not with my husband, if I really liked them, I would have room for somebody, right? I would have patience, I would get to know them, but like I would also be vetting somebody if I was dating them, right? Like I would be like, like what do I want in a relationship? Is this person like lining up with that? And am I a good fit for them too? I would take the dating stage as it should be as like a vetting process. And if somebody started having really unhealthy behaviors, I would probably set a deadline because I like my peace. I like my happiness, and so I'd probably set a deadline and be like, I'm going to go to this person. I'm going to talk things out. I'm going to try to hash things out. I could have a lot of patience and compassion and room for somebody if they're doing the work. But if instead I communicate a need like, hey, I want us to communicate better and more kindly in the relationship, and the person like dismisses it, never shows up, speaks like a jerk all the time, like I like it wouldn't be a part of my comfort zone. I wouldn't be willing to continue in that kind of relationship with somebody because it wouldn't be meeting my needs. It wouldn't be fair or healthy. And so, generally this is what you'll see with a secure person. They will get into a dynamic where they'll have a lot of patience, a lot of room. But if somebody isn't ending up like doing the work or showing up in a healthy way, if they're just unhealthily dysfunctional and they're like too bad, deal with it, you're not going to really see somebody stay in that relationship and invest long term. When people would come into my office, so I went from eventually working with individuals to then working in relationships and with couples. And when people come into my office, the number one thing I would look for, I really didn't care how much trauma someone had. I didn't really care how much like fear someone had or how many core wounds they had. I just cared like, are both people going to show up? Because if they do, we can do all the core wound reprogramming. We can learn about needs and learn to speak to each other and the needs. We can easily learn to regulate our nervous system. Like there's so many things we can fix so easily with a little consistency over time. But if one person's not willing, then like you have to imagine like you can be secure, you can be really showing up, but how that person's showing up if they're unwilling to change and the needle's not moving at all and they're not even trying, then what you're going to see currently is what you're going to get forever. And you have to decide if that's acceptable for you or not.
Yeah. That makes sense. And that's really, it takes two in a relationship to make it work. And if one person's not showing up, it's never going to work, despite the fact that, like there's attraction, all these factors that go into like why you're with that person. If they're not going to show up at the end of the day, no matter what you do, it's not going to
And
happen.
And the attraction part is dating honeymoon stuff, right?
Yeah,
Dating
you're right.
honeymoon, that's the biggest thing. Eventually, you're going to get into the power struggle, and you can be so attracted to the person for other reasons, like physically attracted, or even just attracted to like another thing that drives attraction is like traits. And if the person meets your unmet needs, those are like the other two really big things. So we can have that. That can be a part of it. This person, you're attracted to certain traits in somebody. I'll just for one moment, there's something called trait variety. So biologically we're wired for this, right? If somebody is like hundreds or thousands of years ago, if people were out trying to survive in the world and somebody really smart pairs up with somebody really strong, they have a better chance at surviving. So we're actually attracted to people who we have repressed traits from. So like if, for example, one thing when I first met my husband was super assertive and just had no problem being like, no, I don't want to do that with like everybody in his life. And for me, I was like, not like that. I was like, I should make sure everybody's happy all the time. So I was really attracted to that. Like, I was like, oh, wow. Like, I like really admired that it was like so easy for him to just be like that. And so, we tend to be attracted to our repressed traits. That tends to be very dating and honeymoon. if we don't actually solve for those things, okay, if we don't learn to take on some of those traits and do the work, the very things we're attracted to early on will be the things that tear the relationship apart in the dating phase, in the power struggle stage. So basically, what will happen is you're like, oh, I'm so attracted to the assertiveness. Power struggle stage comes, you're like, this person never makes room for my needs. They're just so assertive all the time. They don't compromise. Or you're like, oh, I'm so attracted to the person who's like so easygoing. And then in the power struggle stage, you're like, they never make a plan and it drives you nuts. Like, so the things we're attracted to, they also won't sustain that long. Ultimately, what sustains and what the biggest overarching theme is if the subconscious comfort zone that you have in relationship to self is mirrored to you back by the other person.
Okay. That makes sense. That makes sense why makes sense why a lot of relationships ultimately fail too.
Exactly.
I want to ask you one last question before we wrap things up in a moment. You mentioned in the beginning when we talked about what attachment style actually means, it's really giving and receiving love. And there's another thing out there. There's another theory, a psychological theory or whatever you want to call it in this space, which is the five love languages.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the five love languages and how does it how does it go hand in hand with what we're talking about today, if it does at all?
Totally. It's actually a really good question. So the five love languages are the work of Dr. Gary Chapman. He talks about five love languages. I'm just saying for anybody who doesn't know this.
Hmm.
They are quality time, physical touch, words of affirmation, acts of service, which is like, I'll make you a coffee or I'll cook you dinner, like doing acts for somebody, and then gifts. First of all, there's actually a correlation between attachment styles and love languages. Generally, you'll see more avoidant. This is not like super cut and dry, but there's a correlation.
Hmm.
Um, you'll see more avoidant people prefer less vulnerable love languages. Okay, so you'll take like a really strong dismissive avoidant. They're probably when you get to the power struggle stage going to be less touchy feely because it's a very vulnerable, like more intimate thing, and they're probably going to be less like quality time. I want to be really present and open up my emotional world to somebody because their own vulnerability scares them. So you're going to see them trend towards gifts, acts of service is usually the biggest love language for a lot of like dismissive avoidance, or some words of affirmation, kind of a high level where it doesn't feel too deep or too vulnerable. You'll see anxious attachments on the other side of the continuum tend to be more in the vulnerable love languages. They want all the connection. So they'll be like physical touch, quality time people, words of affirmation, like those more vulnerable things in more deep ways. Anxiously attached individuals tend to like kind of like all the love languages, but they trend towards the more personal, deep ones that are more intimate than the other ones. So you will see that correlation that exists. Fearful avoidance can kind of have either way. Um, and I also think that our needs are more important than our love languages. So needs being a part of our attachment style. I can tell you right now, as somebody who had like, I think this is a good example. So my highest love language was quality time, is quality time. And my one of my biggest needs as an attachment style was emotional connection. If I'm spending quality time with somebody, like watching Netflix or like watching a movie or like playing a sport with a group of people, I'll get something from that, but that won't be the same as like sitting down at dinner and like having a really deep conversation because the emotional connection is the need. And I think that love languages are really good and they're a really good thing for us to pay attention to. But when we know our needs in a relationship based on what our attachment style is, and we can go direct to the need, meeting the needs is like a more specific version of a love language and it actually goes a much further way. And like you can have, there's so many layers to that, but just I think that that's great for sure. It's super interesting, but your needs and really knowing your needs will actually have a bigger impact on how loved and connected you feel to your partner when you know exactly what your needs truly are.
Wow, that's so interesting. And so you're saying too, we didn't super dive into the five pillars here, but you're saying as part of the need thing, generally speaking, do different attachment styles have like groups of needs that fit them too?
Yeah. And like if you look at anxious attachment styles, a lot of their needs in relationships tend to be things like reassurance, certainty, validation, encouragement, intimacy, or closeness. It can be like physically, it can be sexually, like just feeling that sense of closeness to somebody. They tend to need a lot of certainty in terms of like planning things, knowing that somebody's going to show up, make an effort. Consistency is a really big one. So those are more anxious needs. Those are the big ones. Dismissive avoidance, they tend to be like autonomy, freedom. They also, those are the really obvious ones. They also really need small bits of acknowledgement and appreciation. Gives them a sense of like, I'm doing the right thing in a relationship. When somebody says, hey, I notice you're really showing up and trying to do this, or I notice you're working really hard lately. The anxious version, right, is more like, you're amazing, you're the best partner, right? It's more these like big like encouragement, like validation, but this is like acknowledgement for behaviors dismissive avoidance tend to need a lot more of. And then they really take to, although you might not see it, they really take to empathy and acceptance. Being accepted is like one of the biggest things that a dismissive avoidant needs in a relationship. And because it goes against their shame wounds, right? Like they feel, you go through neglect as a child, you feel like I am shameful, that we internalize neglect in a terrible way. So when somebody's accepting, it's the opposite of being shamed, right? It's I'm accepted, I'm not shameful. So it really like hits home with them. Fearful avoidance need totally different things. They tend to need, yes, some degree of like validation and reassurance, but more they need like depth. They need a lot of things related to trust, transparency, consistency, congruency, context for why people do the things that they do, because it helps them feel safe, like they can open and they can actually connect with somebody. And then they need novelty, they need exploration. They tend to be like explorers and they need change, and they don't do so well sitting in the same space all the time. So those will tend to be some of the big needs. And if we don't know what each other's needs are and we're not feeding into them, needs are like the lifeblood of relationships. They're like how we nurture the relationship, just like human beings need oxygen and water, relationships need an exchange of needs. And so when we don't know that, it's like you're doing a relationship like missing all the important ingredients of it.
It sounds too real quickly. I promise we're going to wrap up in just a second, but it sounds to me too like even when you become a secure attachment, you still kind of harbor some of those old needs from the attachment you used to be. Is that right?
Exactly. So what you'll actually find is, I'll share from a personal space. So I was extremely like freedom, exploration, novelty person. As I got more secure, I actually valued stability more. So that would be a big securely attached need. So you'll have needs that rise up, but because your needs are not wounded, right? You're not really working on reprogramming them. So you'll still have those flavors to your personality. I still
Yeah.
really care about those things. I still am not good at doing the same thing over and over again. I need novelty. I need to try new things. So I still have a lot of those fearful avoidant parts, but I also just came to value things like stability and consistency a little more than I ever had before as I became secure. What you'll see really change is your core wounds. We're not projecting, oh, trust is going to be broken, I'm going to be abandoned or trapped. We're not projecting those out anymore because they're not a part of our programming. So your core wounds go away. New needs will come in a little bit, but a lot of your needs and your personality will stay. And then you'll be more emotionally regulated in your nervous system, less triggered, less likely to get triggered, more calm, more rooted, centered in your body, and better at being communicative and vulnerable to people as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. As you're reading off the anxious ones, I'm like, damn, I still have a lot of those needs.
Yeah, and that's good. That's personality, right? That's not
Yeah.
a that doesn't that won't change, right? We're not trying to like change who we are, what matters to us. We're just trying to change the wounds that were there from the
Yeah.
beginning.
That makes sense. Totally. All right, Thais, it's been such an incredible time with you. Such a really fascinating interview. I'm actually going to grab the book too so I can learn some more about this stuff. And like I said, we'd love to get you back on the show. But before that time, what is a last send-off takeaway message for our audience and a place our listeners can check out your work, your book, and the personal development school too?
Okay, so send off takeaway message. I would say just if anybody is healing and anybody's going through like their attachment style now and being like, oh yeah, I'm insecurely attached. It's not your fault. Like it's just everybody can have like compassion for themselves. It's not your fault if you had bad modeling growing up. Um, but it is your responsibility. Only you can really do that work, right? So I think there's sort of those be compassionate, but also show up for yourself, right? So and then where you can find me is Personal Development School dash Chais Gibson on YouTube. I put daily content out there on YouTube and all about attachment styles and relationships and the subconscious mind. And then personaldevelopmentschool.com, I have a free attachment style quiz. And we actually do on the same website. You'll get a report with the attachment style quiz. It goes with all of your core wounds, all the info. And then we do a integrated attachment theory certification training for people who want to get certified in this, be able to run a practice. We teach the whole business side of it as well. And that's also at personaldevelopmentschool.com.
Awesome. Guys, make sure you check it out. Sounds incredible. And the book as well. That's obviously on Amazon or
Yep, on Amazon,
Just search it up.
exactly. It's
Okay,
called
so
Learning Love, and then it says Integrated Attachment Theory.
awesome. Check out the YouTube channel, personaldevelopment.com, and also the book, which I'm going to grab a copy of because I love this topic. And Thais, thanks again for coming on. Really do appreciate it. And take care, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so fun.